So we're gonna start. This is about connective tissue. This is about being able to program actions.
So actually, a bunch of times today, it's come up that and I think Dennis has said it really well. There should be plumbing that really helps people connect a lot of apps. Plumbing that helps us figure out all the stuff's going on. And we all seem frustrated that Apple and Google are not building this into iOS and Android at the rate of innovation that we all really want to see. But fortunately, we have two guys that are up here. So I thought it'd be great if each of you could just introduce your companies and how you think about it a little bit, and then we'll dive into some topics around deep linking and the notifications bus for everything, and how what you guys are learning can affect most of these apps and where it can all go.
How's it going? My name is John Milinovich from URX. We're a mobile-first discovery platform that lets developers distribute and monetize their content. So ultimately, when we kind of think about what happened with this move to mobile, was this, unbundling of the browser into many different apps. But a lot of what was lost with that was that there's no way to actually then effectively navigate across these apps. So kind of our goal is to then help kind of bring browsing back to mobile by giving every developer the same types of tools that a Google or a Facebook have with their own knowledge graph or things like app indexing, to actually then give them this contextually aware piece of real estate that they can then use to connect to other apps that matter to their users.
Awesome. So deep linking and indexing. So Linden.
Cool. So my name is Linden Tibbets. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called IFT, also sometimes referred to as If This Then That. What we do is we help people get more out of the services and devices they use all the time. And specifically, I think what you can see on the surface, that's a set of user experiences. We allow people to make connections between services. We follow this simple format. If something happens, then do something else, at least for now. Examples would be, if it's going to rain tomorrow, send me a text message today so I don't ride my bike. Or if there's a new apartment post on Craigslist in my price range, probably isn't happening in San Francisco now, then send me an email. But then I think what's really kind of below the surface, and what not a lot of people see yet, we have a developer platform that allows anyone, or eventually anyone as we open it up, to plug in as a developer and begin to participate, at least as the first step in this platform that allows their users to take their services further.
Cool. So it sounds like we basically, in the old days, we used to have, with the web, everything had a URL. So it was really easy just to pass a URL around to almost anybody, and it could go through email, it could go through notifications, it could go through an SMS, it could go through anything. It would open up a web page, and that would have a lot of contextual information for what we want. This does not work very well on mobile. The app itself can send some notifications. I know it's something you guys are working on a lot, but why has deep linking been so hard? Like, what have developers done wrong? What have Apple and Google done wrong that hasn't made it feel as nascent and vibrant of an ecosystem?
I think, first and foremost, just the development paradigm for apps is different, right? You don't think about it in terms of having different pages in a domain, but it's different states or different views, right? And traditionally, these things didn't have uniform locators that you could actually then link to that specific state in a way that you could then send to a friend. So I think a lot of the core issue is that from the beginning, people just didn't think about apps in the same way that they thought about websites. And ultimately, what we've kind of started to see happen in the last 2 years is that people start to understand that you should actually be able to discover an app for what's inside it, right? So you should actually be able to send a link that took a user into the right part of an app, just the same way that links work on the web. So really what deep linking is, very simply, is just the ability to kind of bring apps back up to parity when it comes to instantiating different parts, just the same way you would with a website.
So when it comes to notifications, we've been talking a lot today. Have you done any testing, or do you have any data that shows where deep linking into something through a notification is meaningfully different than, and what should developers be doing that they're totally missing the boat on?
Yeah, it's 100% yes, right? You kind of even thinking about this outside of the app ecosystem. If you were gonna have an ad on AdWords and it was for red Nike running shoes, then you clicked on it and it took you to Amazon.com instead of to a product page within Amazon, you can have to imagine that the conversion rates are orders of magnitude less because of this. And developers that we work with have seen the same thing in mobile, where anywhere from 10 to 30 to 40% higher conversion rates, just simply by virtue of the fact that they actually take a user to the point of an app where you can actually do something.
And what's the balance between the mobile web, where you can make a little page for everything, versus taking people into the app? Is that much different? Like, I'm just really curious of like how that actually plays out over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think Fred Wilson wrote a really good blog post last week saying like the mobile web is the top of the funnel, whereas like apps are the bottom of the funnel. So I think that what we're going to see start to happen is that the difference between apps and the web, it's all kind of bullshit anyways. It's going to start to go away. I think there's a lot of reasons why apps will always remain important, but I think more than anything else, like the mobile web should always be important and should be something that actually then drives users into apps when it matters. For something like viewing content, it might not be as important as something like making a purchase or booking a lift, right?
So that's a really interesting example to say that I loved Fred's article about the mobile web being top of the funnel. And actually, if you think about almost everything that's been talked about today, notifications really are the bottom of the funnel, right? They really are like you got the app, how you got it, and we're trying to use notifications to really retain you. It's interesting, Linden, that a lot of the stuff you talked about for your examples weren't really about the sort of same stuff we've been talking about today, notifications for retention or bringing you back to the app or reminding you it's there, but really this other kind of information. Like, how do you think about this for IFT? Should there be a main bus, or should every app have its own notification channel? Should we just kill notifications and only have IFT?
Wouldn't I like that? I guess I think that there's a lot of nuance to that question. I think one, I would have to say there is a profound difference between the mobile web and the app world. Is one, you got to download the damn thing, and that's a huge barrier. No matter where you're going, imagine even if you could index and search, everything within every app. If you still don't have that app, you haven't created an account in that app, you haven't set up that account. There's still this big barrier. And so I think that's really one problem. And there's kind of a range of other problems that individual app makers will have to deal with. I think one that's come up now kind of time and time again in every conversation I've heard today is really this problem around context. How do we know when to send a notification? How do we know? And I think it's context within the realm of notification is just one aspect of context. How do we make our app relevant once they're inside the app for the user? And I think there's so many things that will have to come together to really make an impact and make the right set of tools for developers to take advantage of context. And I don't necessarily think it's just Google and Apple. I think they know a ton. Don't get me wrong, but I think every individual person here that has an app today also knows a ton about their users within that product. And there's kind of a ton of context locked up within those applications that I think is kind of waiting to get out. And I think that's going to be one of our opportunities in the future as we ask developers to integrate with us, to plug into IFT, to get something in return, to get something. And what they're getting right now is this ability for their users to use their service in kind of a multitude of ways. So, thousands and thousands of ways. I think last check we're 30 million individual recipes right now. And so I think that's really the tip of the iceberg. So if we can help developers understand that context piece, I think that's really the first step. It's not necessarily, hey developers, we're going to tell you that it's not about having an app and it's not about sending users to your app. My guess is people aren't going to buy that, at least for a while. But can we help them instead understand understand some of that context piece? And I think we can.
That's interesting that the way that you're thinking about developers, both of you kind of really needing to drive this ecosystem. Developers, though, do always have this incentive of give me more users, kind of at the expense of even if it litters some of the rest of the network with spam. And so you're kind of fighting against Google and Apple that are constantly trying to at least keep the place as clean as possible. And when I was at Facebook, we spent a lot of time realizing everybody was cluttering it and we had to keep things cleaner, or at least we had to keep changing the rules, which meant that people then said, oh, well, how do we hack the new system? As we open up notifications more and everything can talk through, or we open up deep linking, I'm just curious of how have you been fighting on the deep linking side with Apple? I know there's a bunch of people who've hacked some of the systems, so now deep linking is really, really closed. You can't even tell what apps people have. Can you talk more about that so we can understand what's really going on and sort of the war with Apple on deep linking?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so taking a step back, right? So I think when you look at the web at large, no one had to ever argue over how HTTP worked. At least not until that was defined and everybody started using it. But what's kind of starting to happen now, and particularly with the newest version of Android as well as of iOS, is that basically the way that you actually resolve links is actually completely proprietary to the platform, right? So that even if, as a developer, you've set up deep linking such that a specific piece of content on the web is mapped to that piece of content within your app, instead of you as the developer being the person to then actually drive that user into the app, or even for that matter, knowing that the user went to the app instead of the web, that's now actually up to the operating system. So this is actually pose a significant challenge to developers who probably aren't just developing for one platform, but are developing for many platforms, but also then have to then continue to update and support many different standards that are starting to emerge around how do you tell Google that your app supports deep linking so that you can actually show up in something like Google Now, or how do you tell Apple that what your universal links are so that when a user searches in Spotlight, your app shows up, right? There's this kind of ever-changing ground beneath the beneath developers, and I think it just makes it even more of a pain in the ass, frankly, to have to think about how do you actually, distribute your content.
Well, I heard a great story on deep linking that Twitter wrote a little thing in their app that basically scanned like 100,000 apps to figure out what you had on your phone, and then Apple actually shut it off and said that you can't use the can has open
Can look URL.
Huh?
Yeah. Can look URL.
Can look URL.
Yeah.
They actually shut it down because of the Twitter. They actually launched this feature, and then they came out and said, we can do app targeting based on what's on your phone, and actually got shut down. Is that true? Is there more to it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a little more to that. So I think, so for perspective, so we've built like a search platform that then is able to figure out based on a user's context and the entities they're reading about, their location, everything we can understand or developer can give us from their first-party data, like what's the best next thing to show that user, and we kind of then represent this in like a kind of like a Facebook news feed type thing with Google Now cards in it, where you can like, sorry, that was the most VC thing I've ever said. But basically, like the opportunity, right, is that you show the things from within the apps that the user already has first, to then make sure that they go to the most relevant place. But one of the changes that was recently made in iOS 9 is that you can't actually detect what apps are installed on a device. Part of the reason for this is that companies would, as companies do, kind of find ways of gaming the system, where the intended use was that if you're a company that has many different apps like Foursquare, you can actually then check to see, does a user, if I'm in Foursquare, does the user have Swarm? If so, deep link. If not, take them to the App Store or the web. But then you also have companies like Twitter who are using this and had like every possible deep link schema, and then in the background would go and try to open a million different apps, figure out which apps you had installed, and then use that to then create behavioral profiles to target against, right? So for every well-intentioned SD or API, then there's people who abuse it. So one of the things that they then did was lock it down to then make you have to go through Apple to do this resolution that we talked about earlier. There are some other speculation that is purely, it's my opinion, but not official, that this is also a very clear way for Apple to then block out Google while they then build their own search property, right? So that, again, if you have to go through Apple and you then have them be able to understand and facilitate, how do you route users? You can imagine that's a pretty rich data signal that you can then use to, help Siri or help Universal Search.
So sounds like one of the goals we should all take away from today is like, can we build some open platforms that sit on top of that? And like, how can we actually support that? Like Linden, I think you actually been trying to build this in notifications where you're really letting anybody plug in and connect any two services together in a unique way. How do we actually help you get this in front of a lot more people, or what does that mean? Because it's hard for a lot of users to individually program their own things.
Sure, and I think one of the things that we've done so well so far is that really attracted the folks that are willing to go over a little bit of a barrier to get what they want. So all the notifications that we're sending are notifications that someone has essentially said, I want this. I explicitly want this. So we send about over about 10 million notifications a day. Now, this is a combination of, it could be email, text message, so there's kind of a lot of things lumped in there. But I think that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think where we can go from there, kind of like I alluded to earlier, is really helping developers get, like we said, smarter about when to send some of these notifications, and even start to work with the developers to figure out what do they really want out of having a mobile app in the first place. I think I think we can all see the surface area, specifically the pixel-based surface area that's available to developers is shrinking rapidly. We see Google and Amazon and every one of the 5 horsemen, or however many horsemen there are, experimenting with some type of future interface that doesn't really have pixels much at all. And so how do other developers really plug into and take advantage of that interface? And I think this is going to be a multi-year conversation and really exploration, but things like what Foursquare is doing, things like what Estimote is doing, I think can really be the tip of the spear. There's, I think, so much other contextual information locked up in other applications that could really benefit folks. It's not just about what Google and Apple know.
Can I, so Linden, could you talk a little bit about the Today tab? Because, go for it then. Because we haven't talked about it at all, and it's right up there. It doesn't push, but it's the same, and you guys are doing, programmable instances.
Yeah, what I was going to ask, I mean, John, we're both having the exact same thought, because we've talked a lot today about notifications in the moment, in time, buzz you when you're there. We haven't talked about summaries. We haven't talked about, like, what happens when I tell you all the things that I want to hear from, but how do you give it to me at a different cadence? I mean, Apple's tried this with the Today tab. I think you've done a ton of stuff looking at the iOS indexing stuff, that's sort of the search side that some of that surfaces on today. Like, how do we take advantage of some of these summaries and collecting all the stuff that's going on in a much better way?
Yeah, I think that also relates a lot to context. I think notifications, and we kind of have to accept that as I think it's very sexy to say that notifications are the next app and the next, like at some point in time, like right now I take notes on Post-it notes. Anytime I want to take a note, if I got a notification right before I did that, totally useless, right? But this interface, this use is still there. And it's the same with lots of apps too. There's just no amount of context besides, knowing the second before I know it, somewhere in the brain, that it's going to say, hey, you should open this app right now. So I think that's a little bit of what the things like the Today screen can really help. And so if you start to think about organizing that in a way, or even if you see some of what Apple's experimenting with on the lock screen, the little apps that show up, and I kind of still confused around, half the time they never work when I try them. But I think those are really important, and they're really tightly coupled with notifications. They're about having the right action at the right time, but not necessarily having to bother you about it. But you have this confidence that when it is time to open your phone, it's time to, you're going to be one step away or half a step away from doing the thing you want to do, rather than 20 and opening an app and jumping between 2 apps.
So if you're counseling a developer, do you tell them to build a Today widget right now, or do you tell them, not to waste their time on it, just to push more notifications through?
I think that's a good question. I think that's yet to be seen. I think one of our products is called Do, and that it's effectively a button. And I think in our classic sense, it's really about the end user empowerment right now. It's about what do end users want to do with the services they use most. And I think a big shift for us, and I think for a lot of the developers over time, is going to be, okay, well, what do developers really want to do? And how can we help developers tackle problems cross-platform, problems without actually needing to have an app installed? And I think one of those problems is the widget problem, and buttons can live all over the place. They're just buttons. If you look at things like the tweet button and the like button, I think those are great instances of buttons pre-programmed for a very specific use case. Because of that pre-program, users understand exactly what they do. It makes it a little bit easier.
And by Today, by the way, I also meant doing like a Google Now card. Yeah. So let me ask you like the opposite question for your world and deep linking and in all this content that's on the phone. Are you helping all developers, you say, like get on top of app indexing with both Google and the iOS search version of it? Like, are you guys like the instrument to actually do that? Is that something that every developer should be totally adopting yesterday?
Yes, I mean, even maybe, so again, if you're just talking about the like Today screen, really, that's just like one of what these many different like discovery surfaces that are starting to proliferate across, everything on your device, right? So certainly, if you're as more so than maybe going and building a Today widget now, I'd say think about how you can then make sure that your information shows up like everywhere, right? So certainly, through things like app indexing or universal search, or building a Today card if that makes sense. I think more importantly is really making sure that your content is accessible everywhere. And certainly UX, as well as several other companies, are trying to, from an open source perspective, provide the tooling to help people do that. But but I think then, what remains to be seen is what will that kind of will there be a single killer interface that everybody uses to discover everything else? I don't necessarily think so, but if not, what does this kind of new future look like?
So if you follow, the consumer internet and what's been happening in China, WeChat's, really become the kind of main portal platform surface that pretty much everything else is getting built on. It has identity, it has context, it has other things. This hasn't quite happened in the US at all. And so this is why we're sort of connecting all these things through other systems. Do you think that's just because no product has actually gotten good enough in the same way that WeChat has? Or do you think there's something structural about sort of how all of our developers work in our ecosystem that we've not had something like WeChat surface, so instead we've had to glue everything together this way?
I mean, I think that I would assert that if that were going to happen, it would have to be a part of the operating system, just simply based off of how the incentive structure is set up today. I'm not sure if if you had to actually go install something to then go figure out everything else that you've installed, just conceptually, I don't really think that would work. I do think that again, when you ask somebody from Apple or somebody from Google about that same question, they would say that that's the whole now swipe twice to the left thing will do, or what the whole long press on Android will aspire to be. I know there's a lot of cool companies that are trying to build that common interface. I'm just not sure if it can get widely distributed enough to be ubiquitous.
Yeah, I think WeChat is incredibly interesting to me. I think it's, and looking historically, I think WeChat is subject to the same kind of tides of bundling and unbundling that everyone is. And I think historically you could say, well, WeChat already happened, and that was AOL. It's like everything in one place. And I didn't make that up. John made that up. I read that out.
John made a lot.
Okay. So anyways, I think this idea of everything together in one place, when a user or anyone in the world really understands something and really gets value out of it, it's so easy to just tack on other things to it. And so I think that first step is, what is the thing that a user really understands and really gets value out of? And whatever that thing is, there's always the opportunity to then start adding pieces to it.
So, and one kind of piece to that I see that really gets me excited that's happening in iOS and has been a part of Android is actually now having a back button, so you can actually imagine that the idea of there is no browser on mobile, right? There's Safari, but that's not the whole point. There's 36 apps that everybody has installed, but Safari is only one of those. So if you can actually have a way of having the OS actually then replicate what the browser was on desktop, other than the fact that you don't have to install websites, I think that could be an interesting opportunity to think about as well.
Awesome. So you got two of the guys who are living and breathing developer platforms up here all the time. Do people have questions for these two? If not, I have one more.
7. So that the back button thing, just because I can't see your faces, your hair is lovely, by the way. The back button thing is interesting because iOS 9 actually does have
I'm in the middle of this event.
a back button affordance now. And I think it's one of the reasons they changed the multitasking interface to be interleaved panes as well. Not only to save space physically, but also to give you an idea of a timeline. And so the back button affordance that appears in the upper left corner allows you to kind of move backwards through your actions. It's all part of kind of a wrapped up thing of allowing you to continue maintaining context. But when you think about it in terms of notifications, when somebody acts on a notification, they're being taken to an unfamiliar place. So it seems like there's an opportunity to use deep linking, for instance, to give people a sense of place of where they are when they act on a notification. So if they get a drop down, for instance, inside an app and go there, and you can say, hey, don't worry, you can act on this, and you can still get back to where you were. So it seems like there hasn't been a lot of work in this space of giving people the comfort, the ability to navigate into these links and still maintain a sense of place. So do you think an ability to do that now that wasn't there before, or are we still not there yet?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question, right? I think that the only persistent understanding of where I was before where I am today is now it says go back to Slack, right, or go back to Foursquare, right? So I think that the way that a developer might be able to be sensitive to that is an interesting idea. I think that again, when you think about these new navigational elements that are starting to proliferate, hopefully those will then be able to kind of assist users as well. But I don't have a clear answer, unfortunately.
And I think it's a really interesting observation on iOS 9 and just like the change in the animations of the back button, most obvious change. But that change in animation, it's now a distinct, I would almost argue that it makes it harder for a user to realize that they've left the current app. Before it was very much of like, you're stepping out of this and you're coming into that. Where now it's just kind of like, whoop, this comes on top. And so I don't know how much you read into that, but if you think of the user experience, it's almost kind of like, does their user really care where they are as much as they can go back to where they needed, where they were before?
Awesome. Another question up here.
So this back button thing reminds me a lot of an XKCD comic from a little while ago. Well, you remember this guy's walking and saying like, installing apps has become so fast and painless. What if we had a phone that just came with every app automatically installed and downloaded them on the fly? And says I was feeling really good until I realized it invented web pages. Does deep linking, when it's fully deployed, structurally change this? Or is it same old?
Well, again, I think deep linking it's a big conversation, something people get excited about. But again, it's very simply the way of bringing the ability to then link into an app, send some information with it, like UTM parameters, for example, to make the app ecosystem work similarly to the web. I think that when you kind of I saw that post as well. I think I shared that widely internally, but you think of like what, again, it's just a link, right? A link that will take you from point A to point B, but then the next kind of component is then how do you actually like facilitate taking an action on that, right? So that, it'd be really cool if I'm reading about Drake and I want to listen to Drake, I don't have to actually go into Spotify to do that. Mm-hmm. Like how do you actually not only then facilitate the linking of two concepts, but then actually let you take an action without having to change that context in the first place. I think that's still a nascent concept, but something you start to see proliferate.
One more question over here. So
you made an interesting point, which we've been alluding to all day, about the boundary between the lock screen and what's inside the phone blurring. Early in the life of smartphones, we used the lock screen as like a way to stay out of the phone because this was our private thing, and we habituated and asked more from the information that shows up on that screen. But if we're reframing the concept of the notification, I think we have to think about what the new frame is. So if the lock screen isn't really a lock screen anymore, what is it now?
I would say there's so many examples that we've seen today, whether it's the talk about context, the talk about are the operating systems themselves going to help curate or edit or prioritize those notifications. Even the demo today, the push apps, how much interactivity happens on that lock screen. I think if you combine that with, and this is all speculation for me, I think we're going to be spending less time in the guts of our phone as those interactions get richer and more obvious on the lock screen. And so I think there'll just only be more examples of that being an incredibly rich surface. I mean, you talk about a potential to kind of bring back what the browser was. I mean, if you only had one screen and that screen could kind of change in this obvious way that users understood and could keep pace with, that would be the screen to do it.
I actually have a slightly different fear. I worry that the lock screen's becoming just another inbox for me that like I have to deal with. And now if your thumb pushes and it goes way too fast, you're like, oh my God, I just missed all this important stuff that I can't even ever get back to. The only benefit of the lock screen right now versus email is it's easier to make the excuse that I just didn't see it. But I really worry that we're actually back into this idea that like it becomes a task list and yet another inbox for us. And again, because it started with a human was trying to contact you, it was such a powerful thing that we really wanted to read. And as that gets noisy, we're going to need something else, whether it's the two-tap screen or whatever it is to get to the stuff that really matters. Because we think of when the phone used to ring at home when you're 15 years ago or 30 years ago, whatever. You'd be like, oh my God, there's somebody who's trying to reach us. That's like the most exciting, positive sound you would like hear in your house. And now, the phone rings and you're like, oh my God, I don't want to take this call. Like it's most likely even a solicitor or whatever. And so we just have this constant moving from channel to channel to channel.
And not even that, but even from just like a privacy perspective too, right? It's like if, how much of this information, if I can show more information on my lock screen, but yet it's a lot of the information that's more personal or private to me, I almost need like a lock screen for my lock screen, right? It's like.
I want to take this one more question.
I thought one of the most interesting comments made in an earlier panel, I think it was Ori made it, was just the observation that Apple had in the last year increased the max payload and notification from 2K to 4K, and typically those kind of changes presage features that haven't been released yet. I don't know if Poncho's app is taking advantage of that. Is that the music thing, or?
Right now, it's on the limit, but I mean, I want to send GIFs.
Yeah, right. So my question was essentially like any just predictions about beyond this, interactive notifications and quick replies. Like what bigger stuff is coming through notifications next when it's allowed?
I mean, I think as Linden mentioned earlier, these ubiquitous buttons, right? So even if you move away from iOS but look at Android for a second, like you can already retweet, you can reply, you can favorite, you can take maybe the primitive actions of an app from the notification that they send you, right? So I'd have to imagine that same idea would probably translate at least first to iOS before seeing any other more crazy stuff they have up their sleeve.
And you could also imagine if you look at what's on the Force Touch menu for any of the apps that may or may not have implemented that yet, why couldn't you send that as a push notification if you knew that was the action you wanted to take? And so I think it's, again, this shrinking real estate that we're all going to have to deal with as an app developer. It's not just about full screen takeover. How do we fill all these pixels? It's what do our users really want to do, and how does our service help them even when they're not looking at our app?
Microphone.
Notifications are the lowest common denominator between, at least on iOS for now, between the phone, the watch, and the Apple TV. That's the only thing that you can program once and have a universal kind of experience, both binary-wise as well as interface-wise across all three. And I think that's part of the reason for trying out this 4K upper limit, upping it to 4K, and then just new interactions and stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, Naveen. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
So we're going to thank you guys. This is great. Before this panel leaves, though, I am going to just take advantage of my position to demo Linden's socks, which are the absolutely best piece of swag I think I've ever seen, because they are socks as metaphor. So his socks say, if this, then that. So awesome socks. Thanks.
Take a chance to check them out. Very cool.